In this game, Rameshbabu Praggnanandhaa teaches us how to play with a big center. His opponent is Nils Grandelius. This was the 84th Tata Steel Masters. Let's jump right in. Praggnanandhaa has the white pieces. Grandelius has black. D4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5. This is the Grunfeld defense, where black allows white to build a big center, but then attacks it with all of his might. Pawn takes, knight takes, e4, knight c3, pawn c3, bishop to g7. Here we see the main sort of starting position of the exchange Grunfeld. White has these three beautiful, strong pawns, and black is ready to attack them. Queen to a4 is Prag's move. The more common moves are bishop to c4 or knight to f3. Queen to a4, I think, is the fifth most commonly played move in this position. Knight to d7, knight f3 castles, and queen to a3. And again, this is not the most popular move, but Praggnanandhaa likes this square for his queen in Grunfeld. This isn't the only game he's played it. And after these pawns get exchanged, the queen is very flexible on this third rank. c5, again, a standard attacking idea from black. Bishop e2, b6, and h4, another modern concept from Praggnanandhaa. He wants to use the h-pawn to open up the h-file. Very, very common these days. e5. A courageous and serious decision from Nils Grandelius. It's a novelty. He allows Pragg to have a protected pass pawn right in the middle of the board here on d5, and Praggnanandhaa does play d5. What Grandelius would like to do is play the knight to f6, e8, and then d6, because knights are the best blockaders of pawns, because they're the only piece that can jump over other pieces. So knight to f6 is played to begin that journey, and Pragg immediately stops it. He says, I do not want that knight landing on d6, so he plays bishop to g5 and pins it to the queen. Grandelius moves the queen out of the way, also supports the b5 square. This is his pawn majority. He'd like to advance it, and Praggnanandhaa immediately takes the knight. Doesn't want him blockading on d6. Bishop f6, now h5, gaining that space. Bishop to g4, knight to d2. White would be perfectly happy to trade these light-squared bishops. It would remove the two-bishop advantage from black, plus this light-squared bishop is a bad bishop. You see these central pawns are on the light squares, but Grandelius just retreats the bishop. He does not want to make that trade, and the bishop at d7 also supports the b5 push, so Pragg plays c4. That makes it much harder to play b5 and also adds further support to the d5 pawn. Queen to e7, queen to c3. Bishop goes back to g7, queen to e3. Now f5, another serious and committal move. It attacks the base of White's pawn chain on e4, but it opens up his king quite a bit, particularly after pawn takes pawn, which happened in the game. And another thing it does is it makes this e5 pawn a little weak. It can't be defended by another pawn now. It can only be defended by pieces. a4, Praggnanandhaa wants to create a weakness on b6. Bishop f6, a5, bishop g5, queen to h3 with the obvious threat of queen to h8 check, king f7, rook h7, and then taking the queen with check, of course, would just win. So black plays queen to g7 to stop that from happening. Queen to c3, putting pressure on e5. Queen to f6, bishop to d3. Knight f3 hits the pawn and the bishop. Bishop comes back to f6. Queen to c2 places some pressure on this structure from black. Rook a to c8, a slow move, to be honest. I'm not exactly sure the idea behind it, to be honest with you. Pawn takes, pawn takes. Now White has created a weakness on b6, and Praggnanandhaa has play on both sides of the board. A weak king on g8, an open a-file, and a target on b6. Castles, f4. So black has created a structure that's similar to what you see in a King's Indian defense. He'd love to play g5, g4, and attack White's king. And in this structure, these light-squared bishops are very, very important. White really wants them off the board. Black really wants to keep it because he's going to attack on the light squares. So Pragg is going to try to get rid of those light-squared bishops. Rook to a7, of course, pins the bishop. Queen to d6 moves out of the pin. Bishop e2, setting up the exchange of those bishops. Bishop to d8, and now knight to h2. The knight supports the bishop's move to g4. Bishop c7, doubles on the a-file, king g7, and now bishop to g4. forces these light-squared bishops off of the board. Bishop takes, knight takes. And if you look at this position, every single one of white's pieces are better than their counterpart. The minor pieces are better. The knight versus the bishop. The rooks are better. They're doubled on an open file. The queen is better, more space, everything. Rook to f7 to deal with the pin. f3 to strengthen the knight and the light squares. Rook to h8. Queen to b2. Again, keeping an eye on this e5 pawn. Rook to h5 defends the pawn. Rook to b7. And he wants to play the rook up here and double on the 7th rank. We know that's what we would like to do with our rooks, is to double them on the 7th rank if at all possible. Queen to d8 to get the queen into the play via h4. Rook a to a7. And here, queen to h4 just doesn't work because the knight goes to f2, queen h2, king f1, and there's just no way in. All of the squares are covered, and there's just no way to get into the position. So he plays king to g8 first, so the rook at f7 can come over, and then he might be able to generate some play. King to f2, rook to h1, rook comes back to trade. He says, no, I don't want to do that. What he's hoping for is maybe it's an exchange sacrifice on g4, and if that knight is gone, maybe then he can create some problems for white's king. So rook takes c7. Pragg sacrifices the exchange so he can go after this e5 pawn. Rook takes, queen to e5, rook to f7 to defend f4. Now queen to e6. Pins the rook, at f7 and defends the knight. Rook g4 was played, the exchange sack, but now he doesn't even get to ruin white's pawn structure because Pragg can take with the queen. King g7, queen back to e6, queen to h4 check, king e2, queen g5, hitting the pawn, king back, then king to g1. And now the queen has no checks, and Praggnanandhaa is in very good shape. Queen f6, takes. And what Nils Grandelius is hoping for is that the activity of his king, it can enter via these dark squares, will be enough to keep the balance in the endgame, and how Pragg handles that is very instructive. King to f2, king to e5, king to e2, king to d4. And now he's threatening the c4 pawn, but white does not defend it. He plays rook to d1 check instead, and the c4 pawn is poisoned. If he takes, then just d6, and this pawn cannot be stopped. If the rook moves in front of it, the other pawn advances. So he doesn't have time to take the pawn at c4. He has to move back to e5. They repeat moves a couple of times, and now Pragg keeps the black king out by moving his own king to d3, rook to a7, king c3, g5. He can't check on a3 because of this move, king to b2, and if the rook tries to stay active, then just d6 again, and nothing can be done to stop that pawn. So g5, and then king to b3. And you see that white has controlled all of these entry points for the black rook. He can't get into the position. g4, d6, gf3, king e6, and now he plays d7, giving up the extra pawn that he has to transpose into a very specific king and pawn endgame. Rook takes, king takes, king to a4. Now the material is the same. King and 3 pawns versus king and 3 pawns, but Praggnanandhaa is completely winning this position. First of all, he has a protected passed pawn on e4. Also, on the queen side, his king and his pawn at c4 completely hold these 2 pawns back. And after king c6, e5, Nils Grandelius resigned. What would happen? Well, king d7, king b5, king to e6, takes, and the c-pawn would comfortably advance to the c8 square. So I guess that's how you play with a big center in the Grunfeld. Thanks for the lesson, Praggnanandhaa. We appreciate it. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.